Unit 8, which is Cold War and decolonization. So that's why today we're starting with talking about how did the conclusion of World War II lead to the Cold War. And the Cold War, the tension that the Cold War creates is going to really be pivotal in a lot of countries' foreign policy decisions throughout this time period, and also leads to something referred to as the non-alignment movement, because everyone's pretty much on some level forced to pick sides. Either you're going to side with the US or you're going to side with the Soviet Union. And then there were some groups of people that said, no, we don't have to side with either of you. And they tried to kind of push against this whole idea of this, East versus West that develops as a result of the Cold War. But let's talk today a little bit about how this all actually happened. And really, it's the end of World War II that really kind of leads to this. So throughout the course of World War II, there were meetings between the major powers, being, at this point, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, as they would have to discuss different strategies of, what was going to happen during the course of World War II. These are the major allies. So the first question here is, why was the Grand Alliance at the Tehran Conference still sound? So the Tehran Conference was in November of 1943. It was held in Iran, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met. And it's kind of the decisions that they were having at the Tehran Conference was deciding on the final assault on Germany. Like, basically, where was D-Day going to be held? Like, because they knew, at some point there had to be an invasion of Europe, because you pretty much just have the Soviet army left trying to fight on their own, because the British get pushed out once France falls. And yes, there's been air raids and battles in the air, but there's no ground troops on the ground besides the Soviets. And the Soviets are having a very hard time maintaining that, and they need help. So it's decided on how the final assault on Germany is going to go, and it was agreed that the invasion of Europe was going to be held in France in the spring of 1944. So again, this was the planning of what becomes known as the D-Day invasion, or the stormings of the beaches of Normandy. What that means, though, which is very significant, is that the American and the British troops are liberating Western Europe, whereas the Soviets are going to be liberating Eastern Europe. And it was decided there that Germany would be divided up into zones of occupation and partitioned until what they refer to as denazification could occur, until they, identified all of the major Nazis and kind of get them out of positions of power. So this partition, if you look here on the map, was supposed to be between American, British, French, and the Soviets. It wasn't just Germany that was being partitioned. If you notice, Austria is also going to be similarly partitioned. And if you also notice, Berlin, which is really in the center of what is going to be Soviet-controlled territory, was also going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation, because Berlin was the capital of Germany, and that had symbolic importance. What this did was inadvertently set the stage for, Eastern Europe being communist and Western Europe being democratic, and Germany being this united country that is going to stay like that from the end of World War II all the way up until the unification of Germany in 1990 or 1991. So this really kind of laid the stage for this East-West dichotomy that's going to happen. And it wasn't done on purpose. It was done more for strategic, examples. The Soviets are in Eastern Europe. It makes sense that they're going to push east, and that, since the D-Day invasion was set in France, that the American and the British forces were going to push from the west. But then what you have then at the end of the war is you have Soviet troops stationed all throughout Eastern Europe. How do you get those Soviet troops to leave if the Soviet Union doesn't want to leave? The only way you accomplish that then is by continuing to fight, now having former allies fighting with each other. And after World War II, no one was going to be willing to continue to fight and prolong the misery of war, especially what everyone had gone through after World War II. So How could Stalin make sure that his country is safe from further attacks? So in February of 1945, the three men meet again at Yalta. I just wanted to, if you guys just take note of FDR there. FDR is kind of nearing the end of his life. He's going to die of a stroke in the beginning of his fourth term. And you can kind of see, his face is kind of taking a little bit of the toll. And you can see he's not very well. So Russia was the hardest hit by the war. They had the largest proportion of people that were killed were Russian. And Stalin, kind of understandably in that respect, wanted to make sure that they were safe from any further military invasions. Stalin was demanding spheres of influence. He wanted spheres of influence in Eastern Europe so that they could get natural resources and so they could have a buffer between the West. The British and the Americans, we were like, no. We weren't going to, and especially FDR was not going to agree that Stalin could just have Eastern Europe as its own spheres of influence. But the war was still going on. Hitler had not fallen yet. The Nazis hadn't fallen yet, excuse me. So they were willing to kind of like push him off a little bit. Also, remember the U.S. had to also contend with Japan. We had a whole nother war we were kind of simultaneously fighting. But they did, at this meeting, agree to the creation of a United Nations. So that was kind of the give that Stalin was willing to give at this point. But Churchill and Roosevelt did not make any firm agreements on this idea of an Eastern European spheres of influence. So as the war ends, how would the differences between the two sides become apparent? So in a lot of ways, Stalin being aligned with, the British and the Americans, two major democracies, does not make sense ideologically on a political standpoint. And the reason why this alliance held was because of the mutual enemy that they had in the Nazi regime. So once the Nazi regime falls, there's not that much still keeping these groups together. So July 1945, they meet again at Potsdam. Now, at this point, the Germans have been defeated. This is scenes in Times Square with people cheering at the end of the war. This is scenes in Trafalgar Square in London at the end of the war. And also, I should point out that at this point in the war, in the meeting, FDR has passed on. Remember I said he died in office, and Truman is now president. So now that also changes things a lot because FDR had worked very hard to build a relationship with Stalin, and now that relationship is gone, and Truman's kind of thrown into this situation. And I don't believe Truman was FDR's president. Definitely wasn't FDR's vice president through all four terms. I think he was brought in to kind of balance the ticket. So the office of vice president isn't like it is today. Really, back then when you were vice president, you were just hanging around waiting for something to happen to the president. Whereas today, the vice president has a lot of executive function and really kind of helps the president kind of run the executive branch. That wasn't the case back then. So Truman and FDR didn't really have a very strong personal relationship. And so it kind of throws a wrench into the dynamics between the meetings of these three men. So the Grand Alliance had this one common goal, which is to defeat the Nazis, and now they're defeated. So once Germany fell, there was no real common ideas between these three heads of state. Stalin did not want free elections. He was adamant that he did not want free elections. He wanted pro-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe. And Truman was just as strong in his desire for free elections. But at this point, Japan is not defeated, and we do need the Soviets' help to help us defeat Japan. And really, in the end, though, war is going to be the only way to change Stalin's mind. So we're starting to see this deadlock begin to develop between the two sides. Now, after World War II, Churchill actually gets voted out as prime minister, and for a time, he's not prime minister. And while he's not prime minister, because he becomes prime minister again. The British system is a very different system than what we have here in the United States. So you do have people who are prime minister more than once. He makes this very famous speech in a commencement speech in a university in Missouri. And it's been since then dubbed the Iron Curtain speech. And he says in it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but also to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. This speech, which is a pretty long, involved speech, really kind of fans the flames a little bit of this conflict that's going to become the Cold War. So, how did the US take steps to contain communism? So, again, yes, Truman wants to have free elections in Eastern Europe, but Stalin has troops on the ground in Eastern Europe, and is the US really at this point going to risk a war with the Soviet Union? So now it becomes more of the idea that that communism needs to be contained. So the Soviet Union establishes communist governments in Eastern Europe. Now I should mention, pretty much every country in Europe at this time had a communist party. In fact, there was actually a communist party in the United States as well. But left to their own devices, none of these Eastern European countries on their own through a popular uprising would have become communist. So yes, there were some people that supported communism, but it did not have, like, organically on its own, Eastern Europe was not becoming communist. Eastern Europe became communist because the Soviet Union forced Eastern Europe to become communist. So, the Soviet Union, like I said, forces these countries to become communist. They put basically puppets in the positions of power across these countries in Eastern Europe. And then communist guerrilla forces began attacking pro-Western government in Greece. So Greece had a pro-Western government, and you had these communist guerrillas who were trying to push for communism to happen in Greece. Truman and Churchill in particular was very much against this. He was trying to send aid to the Greek government, but London is destroyed and Britain has to kind of rebuild. They have to deal with their empire. They really did not have the position, power, or money at the time to really kind of support the Greek government. And the U.S. pretty much had to step in. So in 1947, President Truman issued something called the Truman Doctrine. And basically he says that the U.S. will provide money to any country threatened by communism. Because our Secretary of State at the time, Dean Aiken, said, like apples in a barrel infected by disease, the corruption of Greece would infect Iran and all the East, likewise Africa, Italy, and France. So the idea is that you have to contain communism. You can't let it expand to any more countries than it's already in. This idea of the Truman Doctrine is going to be very influential in U.S. foreign policy moving forward in the Cold War. And it's going to inform many of our decisions to get involved in places like Vietnam. Korea was a UN operation, but to get involved in Cambodia, to get involved in Afghanistan, to get involved in the Congo, to get involved in parts of Africa, all across South America. It's really going to influence our foreign policy between the United States and Latin America, and how we side with leaders that are anti-communist. And the one thing I should point out, though, is just because you're anti-communist does not necessarily mean you're pro-democracy. So in the end, we wound up supporting some leaders that definitely leaned more towards the authoritarian, just because they weren't communist. Now, another thing that was issued in 1947 was something that was known as the Marshall Plan. June of 1947, the Marshall Plan is issued. And what the Marshall Plan did is it provided economic recovery for war-torn Europe. The idea being that if a country's economy is strong, it will be less likely to find communism attractive. So if we pump money into Western Europe and keep the Western European economy strong, then they'll be less likely to fall to communism. And it wasn't just Western Europe. The Marshall Plan money was actually offered to all the European countries. And some Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia would have very gladly taken that money. But the Soviets would not let any of the Eastern European countries take that aid because the Soviets felt that this was capitalistic imperialism and that the U.S. was using this money to try to force, democracy and U.S. ways of government onto Europe. So the next question is, and actually second to last question. How did Europe become two hostile camps? Now, there was very little uniformity in this whole process of what we refer to as denazification in these occupied zones. So the French, the British, the Americans, the Soviets all had a zone of occupation, and they each had their own plan of how to denazify them. But by February of 1948, the US, the British, and the French were planning to unify their sections, creating a West German government. Now remember, Berlin, which is pretty deep into the Soviet zone of occupation, was still similarly divided. And the Soviets, seeing that these groups are going to be unified into a West German government, the Soviets wanted to push the British, the French, and the American troops out of Berlin, and he wanted to control all of Berlin. So what the Soviets decided to do was to blockade West Berlin. Now, they blockaded West Berlin by cutting off like trucks coming into West Berlin. So they do a roadblock. They can't stop air traffic coming into West Berlin, because if they stopped the only way they're going to stop air traffic is by shooting planes out of the sky. And if the Soviets start shooting planes out of the sky, that's going to start a war. So the US and the French and the British responded by airlifting supplies into the inhabitants, because what the plan had been for the Soviets was they figured if they blockaded West Berlin, basically they'd starve the people of West Berlin out. They would have to fall to communism and fall to the Soviets, and then the Soviets would control all of Berlin, and they would get the British, the French, the American troops out. And what the other side decided to do instead was to airlift supplies. So the Berlin Airlift, is what it's known as, flew 13,000 tons of supplies daily into the city of Berlin in order to keep the people of Berlin fed, and to keep West Berlin from having to fall to communism. And so that's why you see here this little cartoon and them sending food over to West Berlin. And in the end, the Soviets had to renege. This increased the tensions between the two sides, and it led to the formation of the two Germanies. So we see then a formal declaration of West Germany, and then the Soviets respond with the creation of a separate country of East Germany. And then we also see a ratcheting up of tensions between the two sides. So in April of 1949, NATO is formed, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the member nations of NATO were Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, France, Britain, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Iceland, the US, Canada, West Germany, and Turkey. And today, NATO has expanded to almost a lot of countries in Europe. The Soviets responded in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact. So what you have are these two mutual defense treaties, two kind of like armed camps on either side of Europe. And so the Warsaw Pact was Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. So the question then becomes, who's to blame for the Cold War? Because scholars have made arguments for both sides. And in my AP Euro class, we actually debate this, and we read about, like, was it really Stalin's fault, or was it really like FDR's fault? It really also kind of depends on what time period you're reading about the Cold War. But I want you to think about this question: who is to blame for the Cold War? But I really want you to think more about this question, which is, do you think the Cold War was inevitable? And was Stalin justified in his desire for these buffer states between Russia and the West?